So, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's lecture in the lecture series Ancient Adornment. Our speaker today is Dr. Melanie Wasmuth. I'm so pleased that Melanie accepted my invitation to come and give a presentation for us today. I've tried to hunt her for the lecture series for a while, and I was thrilled when she accepted. Um, Our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Wasmuth, or Melanie, has a PhD in Egyptology from the University of Basel and also a docentship in Egyptology and Near Eastern Studies from the University of Helsinki. At the moment, Melanie is a research associate at the University of Basel and also a member of a Center of Excellence, a big collaborative research project at the University of Helsinki called ANI, Among Friends. It's an acronym for Ancient Near Eastern Empires. In this project, Melanie is vice leader of Team 2, and they focus on social scientific approaches to the ancient world. And during this work, Melanie focuses also on kings and queens and royal power and how this plays in with empires. So this is what brings Melanie's research and my own into contact quite frequently, our interest in power, materiality, but also the rituals of power, the trappings of power, beauty, jewelry, adornment, and so on. So in her research in general, Melanie is interested in social dynamics and individual life experiences, and she investigates those by looking at the material reflections of cross-regional mobility and contact in the ancient Mediterranean and West Asian areas. There is one publication that I want to mention for those of you who are here for the lecture today. I think you'll be interested in looking this one up. It's from 2021, and it's called Petrification as a Research Approach, Its Terminological Potential for Material Culture Studies. And it's published in a volume called Petrification Processes in Matter and Society, edited by Hüglin, Gramsch, and Seppänen. And if you go to our website, you'll find a reference there for this publication as well. So the title of Melanie's lecture today is Beautiful Blossoms for Eternity, Floral Jewelry in Ancient Egypt. And with this, I'm going to unpin myself and instead put a zoom pin in Melanie and say thank you so much for being with us, Melanie. Thank you for saying yes to giving this talk. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne. I'm really, really pleased to join you for this lecture and also especially for giving this lecture today. As those of you who have been in contact with my research probably know, this is not what I'm usually dealing with, but it has been cropping up in one way or the other for quite a while, and I'm very pleased to share with you not any answers. I'm sorry I can't give those, but some evidence and some thoughts and questions I have been bothering with and collecting for today. So, do you see what you are supposed to see, Anna?
Yes, we do. It looks very good.
Lovely. So, as Anna has been mentioning already, one of the impulses for this lecture has been this petrification paper. This was once more an invited talk in 2016 originally for the Association of European Archaeologists, where I've been asked to provide an outside Egyptological view for material studies primarily concerned with Northern Europe on the concept of petrification. And what I've been trying to do there is to take on the one level this word petrification and think about what it could denote if you want to develop it into a research approach, and came to the idea that it could actually mean the standard term petrification, meaning fossilization, meaning organic material being visible at some point via its imprint in stone, which we don't have from Egypt because it's not long enough ago, but potentially could have from the organic remains. Then it could be meaning made of stone, made like stone, or also rendered in stone. And yeah, looking at various object categories and see whether they are reflected in Egypt. And one of these categories has been actually jewelry and amulets, where you can very clearly see in the Egyptian evidence that we do have actual realia, organic flower material for flower jewelry. And then we have kind of imitations of that in semi-precious stones. It would be made of stone. Then we have it in an artificial material, typically called faience. In actual fact, it's more a frit material. And we also have a huge amount of depictions of it. And one of the things was not the key point of the paper, but one of the things that were really coming up is that by this conceptualizing it in different ways, you really get a bit closer to which aspects are actually relevant for its physicality, for its materiality, and which aspects are culturally invested. And these are some of the questions I have, and again, some that I will pose, but unfortunately, I will not be able to answer. But as also said, it's not the only impulse that got in there. I had two other impulses over the last years. One was rather recent. I've been giving courses for children, doing paper crafts. And while looking then through suitable imagery, it was very clear that in what is typically published, nearly everything includes flowers and often also flower jewelry. So we really have an omnipresence of flower adornment, whether for body adornment or for architecture adornment in Egypt. But if you are then looking at the handbooks, and we are in the lucky situation that for ancient materials, we actually do have handbooks for ancient Egypt, flowers do not enter into the realm of what is published. So they're either not included at all or only marginally. And flower adornments, flower jewelry is not mentioned in any of the major handbooks. And it's also only very, very marginally studied, at least on the level of when would the elite wear actual fresh flower colors or whatever kind of jewelry adornments, and when would they wear this imitation, this stone or frit imitation colors, is something that I've not been coming across. I can't claim that it's not published anywhere, but at least it has not been easily findable, even though there are actually quite a number of useful publications bringing up flower jewelry, but yeah, not on this level of when and why are they used instead of others or not. Can I move? Yeah, I can move this around. Perfect. So we will look first a bit at what we have as preserved realia, and they actually all come from tombs, but not only from royal tombs, also from private, so from elite tombs, mainly from Thebes. Most of what is now well preserved nowadays and accessible actually comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which was only excavated in the 1920s, where the archaeologists were already aware of the importance of making sure that also the organic material survives. But actually a lot comes from private tombs and major cachettes that were excavated in the late 19th century. And they actually, Maspero had a colleague with him who was really interested in archaeobotany, who recorded these, but the problem is they didn't manage to take sufficient care to lift the organic preserved floral arrangements, whether for collars or for bouquets out, so they preserve only by now in fragments. What you see here is a view into one of the chambers of the Tutankhamun tomb, and you see on the bier a garland or collar, and on the right at the wall one of those long flower bouquets. So if you know what it is, you may be aware to recognize it. Unfortunately, we only have black and white imagery. But what I find really interesting, I was really happy to find this quote, is that actually this preserved floral features of the tomb have been, to Howard Carter, even more impressive than the gold or other material. What he writes, published in 1927, is among all that regular splendor, that royal magnificence, everywhere the glint of gold, there was nothing so beautiful as those few withered flowers still retaining their tinge of color. They told us what a short period, 3,000 years, really was. But yesterday and the morrow. In fact, that little touch of nature made that ancient and our modern civilization kin. Yeah, and even though also there's, so some of the color was still available, but only parts, but this was really something that must have been really, really immediately touching. So, yeah. And here we see in detail some of the material. We have on the right an Anubis statuette, where what you actually have is not a collar, but a flower garland, but that's wrapped around the throat so that it has the function of a collar. And to the left and middle, the inner coffin of Tutankhamun, where you see on the one side how the coffin is actually shrouded and then covered or wrapped around with flower garlands, and in the middle picture where you have the broad collar that is very, very typically associated with the elite and the kings, wearing in semi-precious stone and gold, but actually preserved here and included in the tomb in fresh flowers, not now anymore, but originally fresh flowers. And as I said, we don't have it only from the tombs of the kings. Here we have evidence from the tomb of the official Ka, and also he has on top of his outer coffin, in this case, a garland of flowers, and his statue, one of his statues, actually still has a garland quasi-collar wrapped around the shoulders, and we have similar garlands at its bottom. It's not quite clear whether they are positioned there as offerings or whether they were actually also originally on him or on the statue and fell down. And here I share the two most or best known collars from Tutankhamun on the left and on the bottom, and the upper right one is once more a garland preserved from this late 19th century. It's a Maspero photograph where you see it's structured a bit differently, but we have similar stuff then also, or had similar stuff from the tombs of the nobles. And what's been really interesting, so at least to me, is to learn about that in 2010, the Museum of the Botanical Museum Zurich, they did some major renovation rearrangement project and came across some boxes that came from these Maspero excavations and were collected by Schweinfurt, and where some of the fragments were still left in and pressed into glass covers and his notes. So they made a major exhibition out of it, 2013 and 2014 in Switzerland, and I've primarily been dealing with the 2014 catalog. Blumenreich, which was taking place here in Basel. And one of these projects that were done in connection with these exhibitions, or with trying to make the most out of this 2010 find, was actually to try and reconstruct how these original flower adornment pieces would look like. And what you have here is from this 2013 catalog, drawings of how parts of these gardens or color parts can be reconstructed or were then to be drawn. And what they also did was really to do modern colors and experiment with the specific materials we know that they used in ancient Egypt for the leaves, for the flowers, and to arrange and to show then also how the weaving, the connecting, the knotting would take place. And here we have then a garland for cornflower, which was very typical. Or here another example, really showing, and we will come back to this, how vivid the coloring of these colors would have been when worn, not necessarily seen then by most people when inside a coffin, but we see it also very much on the tomb reliefs in banquet and feast scenes. And it is to be assumed that they were actually then also worn in practice at certain occasions, even though it's difficult to say when they would wear one or the other. As said already in the introduction, we also have this kind of imitation material. So a lot of colors, not all of them, but a lot of colors that we do have from ancient Egypt actually go back to this flower and or combination of flower and fruit arrangements, whether the more abstract ones are then the same but put just a more abstract level on it, or whether this is a second independent way of creating this collar out of cylindrical beads is something I don't know and I haven't been going into. But you see really the variety and also the mix of colors once more. Then we also have a lot of depictions, and actually on essentially every single type of material that you can think of, we do have imagery of flowers in generally. And especially if you combine them and say, okay, you don't only look at the actual jewelry. So in this case, then the flower, single flower, or sometimes two flowers on the head and the color, but also take attributes that are held in the hand into it, then it's really omnipresent. And we have it here, down here on papyrus, on a stele, in two cases, one in situ on the tomb, inner tomb wall here, taken out and shipped to a museum, on many, many sarcophagi, but also then inner mummy boards or masks. And here as an example, an Ushepti box. What I found really, really interesting is that we have also very exceptionally, but also indications of a different kind of depiction / imitation. We have at least one New Kingdom tunic where actually the dress that is worn depicts this flower color. We have it here on the left. It would be lovely if this would be in color, but well, that's all I can offer. But what we also have not so widely, so what we have very widely is the indication of a flower color on statues and statuettes, not only for females, also for males and for gods, in any material, in stone, in wood, in bronze. But what is relatively more rare is to have then in stone sculpture this single lotus flower that is very, very typical when you are looking at the painted images. But in the statues we have them, but this is a bit more special, let's say. So I wanted to share it with you. Can I move this? No, I can't. Okay. So this is the realia, but now the question is what to do with that, kind of. And we really don't have a lot of information on what was the role of these floral colors, floral jewelry in lived life in this world, but we actually do have some. So what is in a way perhaps the most important source on this is this image from the tomb of I think from the tomb of Nebamun, but I may be wrong there. It may be also Ipui. No matter. One of the Theban tombs where you see the owner of the tomb actually inspecting a group of craftsperson, in this case craftsmen, who are actually creating these floral colors. So that it is rather safe to assume that at least for quite some of the highest elite, and certainly for the court, it was actually not necessary to buy them outside, but they would actually be made, custom made kind of on the major estates, at least if you were high enough official or had some special function so that you would have a need of it. That's at least one possibility. The other is that this is really an exception, and we see here one of the officials who kind of made a business out of getting these garlands made and selling them for high price to anyone else. We can't say. Oh, why can't I? No, here. What we also have is that actually, and this is kind of an important thing to envision if you are looking at the huge amount of colors that were just made for the death, and also then for major festivals or even minor ones, we don't know. But even if you take just death and major festivals, there are huge amounts of flowers that are needed. And Egypt is really a very, very narrow strip of fertile land, which needs to focus primarily on other products than lovely flowers. But what they did, and we have ample evidence how important the gardens were, and that actually every major elite household at least had a garden. We had gardens in the necropolis, we had gardens in the temples, and part of these gardens were always a water source. And in this water source, we typically have water lilies, and these are especially the white and the blue, but also the now extinct red or pink water lily of Egypt have been the most important flowers for these floral arrangements of any kind. But we also see then, if you look at the top here, that these cultivated gardens included then below or beside the trees a whole range of flowers where we don't know whether they were only or mainly cultivated because they were looking nice and were meant to be done for this, were used for these colors, or whether they are actually something that also had other functional purposes. We are unfortunately not in the position of having evidence for being sure on that. But you see here below, so here you see the cultivation, the watering, and the blue water lilies here in the water. And in this lower part, you see the various major bushes and small trees, from which usually the leaves are coming, and in the lower register, the most typical flowers you see, with the cornflower, the lily, the mandrake or persea fruits, and the poppy as key color schemes. As I said, the question is then when they were used. What we can say for certain, because we have the realia that they are used on a wider range. We don't know how wide a range, but certainly on a wider range of burials. We have good evidence, because we have ample depictions, that these similar garlands were actually also used to decorate kiosk shrines, barks, vessels in cultic contexts. And we see them actually being handed out and worn in some of the tombs. So on the upper right, we cannot be fully sure whether they could be floral arrangements or they could be other kinds of colors. But we see here certainly that they are wearing this single flower on top. Only the women. In some of the sarcophagi we have also, in some of the coffins we have also male single flowers, but this is very typically a women's thing. But in this and also in this version, we see actually how the actual color, the flower color, is put on, and it is to be assumed that these are actually, and especially as they are depicted in green or blue, which is the symbol for freshness in Egypt, it is to be clearly assumed that in some cases there we do have, for whatever reasons, the usage of fresh flower colors and not the highly valuable, materially valuable precious stone ones. And what is kind of usually not taken up, but so the last slides will be some further reading. And even though none of the images comes from there, I've also included there one recent paper by Price on the senses of smelling, especially of blue lotus, which is the most important and the most intensely smelling one. But what one really has to envision, that if in all these banquet situations, whether they are having these bouquets in stands around the room, having them in their hand, or are wearing these, that we have really an abundance of color and also really, really strong fragrance. Yeah, so this is something that really, I think, is something which should be, where the question is, why, well, how much can you actually deal with it? So at what time it's actually too much, if too many different fragrances come, but it seems that the most prominent one really is only one flower, the blue lotus. So at least this mix would only be not as extreme as one could imagine, but it really is a feast also for the senses, both the eyes and the nose. So this is kind of a one major issue one can try to get into. How can one figure out whether and why they are used? The other is the question of cultural investedness of value, and here I would like to highlight two aspects: the religious symbolism, which is very, very strongly in the background, certainly for what we call the lotus flower, which in actual fact we are not concerned with the lotus, but we are concerned with the water lilies, 3 different varieties of water lilies. And with papyrus, they have the the strongest connotation, and they are also by far the most used, both in the bouquets and in the jewelry. and there the water lily, what we typically call lotus, has especially two. It's very, very strongly connotated with rebirth and rejuvenation, whatever, you know what I mean. And the one key part of it is this so-called primordial lotus. So the idea that in the beginning of everything, out of the noon, out of the primordial waters, the lotus would, or the water lily would come up, and with it, then the sun would rise. And we have here an image as a sculpture in the round of Tutankhamun in this role of, growing out of this primordial lotus, and in the middle, the so-called sun child, so the child goddess, or the child version of the sun god, who will rise out of the water lily, and especially out of the blue water lily that is closed at night and open in daytime, while the white water lily would be closed in daytime and open at night. And the combination of being open and closing depending on the time of day is very striking for the ancient Egyptian, as symbolizing this circular rejuvenization that they are very strongly believing in and witnessing every day, but also that the water lilies actually will not be sown by hand, but will sow themselves then into the pond again, so that this wonder and amazement of self recreation comes up here, which is the other key issue of making the water lily very, very symbolical for rebirth, and therefore for ensuring life and ensuring longevity in afterlife. And another part that I thought should be included here is then the standard imagery of the god Nefertem, who is actually the god of looking nice, but especially of smelling nice. And he is typically shown with a water lily, an open water lily blossom on the head. And similarly, but with a slightly larger variety, also the color symbolism can at least be easily connected to this rebirth. Most of the major colors are in Egypt, in one way or the other, very, very typically connected to this rebirth or rejuvenation or being strong and vigorous image. One of the exceptions is red, which has a double meaning because it's also the color of Seth, but with being then tamed, it would actually also enforce then this meaning. But there is no certainty whether this color imagery is actually predominantly then magical religious, or to which degree they were also just simply used because they just loved this abundance of colors. It's something you can make a point, or you can make an argument for each color why it could be torn into it, but there is actually not necessarily the need to do that. The flowers could also simply have been cultivated and used in order to look nice. I think the lived realities I've been pointing out, I've just collected here once more this evidence that we actually do have evidence of these colors being made and being put on, being handed out. And we also have this evidence throughout of this smelling the lotus flower, but there the question is, would that fall under adornment or not? And especially there the question, in contrast to the collars and the headwear, I think they are very clearly also have been worn also outside the funerary content, whether this smelling the lotus flower is something that is included into the banquet scene, but is actually a symbolism just for the afterlife, for the funerary context, or whether these were also used, shown, shared in non-mortuary rituals. So I would guess that in funerary or mortuary banquets, that would probably have been the case, because the smelling of the water lily, the blue water lily, would then mean that life gets revigorated. But this is something that's kind of uncertain, or I can't really judge whether this may be really so predominant, because all the evidence is actually from a funerary context, which has a different purpose than at court or in your own major villa than a major celebration. And then finally, I would like to highlight some instances that are dealing with the gender concerns, knowing that at least some of you, certainly also Anne, is rather interested in those, even though they tend not to be my specialty. And what I've been finding interested in there is that we actually have some instances where we can clearly see, at least from the currently available evidence, that regarding flowers, some usage of that was very much women first. So the very first evidence of smelling flowers for women goes back to the 4th dynasty, while for men we only have it in the 6th dynasty. And similarly, the wearing of flowers on the head is, if not solely in everyday life, then done by women, is there. But also quite of the other arrangements seem to have been typically created first for women and then taken over by men. Then we have some instances that seem to be women only, or at least for a while when I was collecting the material, I thought that it would be really women only in every case, that the single flower on the head would be only a women's thing. We certainly have it only for women in the offering and banquet scenes, and we have it predominantly also for the coffins and mummy boards, etc. But I have actually by now been coming across some few instances where also male or young male coffins would have not only this band that is also common for men, but also the single flower, which is very, very, very prominent in the depictions. And what also goes together with it, what is really very much more prominent, at least from what we have as evidence right now, is that the prominence of showing these flower garlands as flower garlands on the coffins is much more typical for women, even though we have it also for men. And at the moment, at least, it's a single instance, there's evidence of Isis. So it's the female woman who is called Isis, not the goddess Isis. And on her coffin, she is actually not only wearing full flower regalia, but also carrying a ranking herbal whatever, but the problem is one doesn't know what it is. And this is very typical, that in detail we often cannot really be sure which flower is actually used, because it's not specifically enough painted or drawn. And I would like to finish with one piece of evidence from love lyrics, where we actually have then the evidence that flowers are used as female embodiment. And we have from the Chester BT1, the one alone, a sister without her peer, comelier than all mankind behold. She is like the star goddess rising at the beginning of a happy year, of sheen surpassing of radiant skin, lovely of eyes wherewith to gaze, sweet are her lips wherewith to speak. She has not a word too much. Long of neck and radiant of nipple, of true lapis lazuli is her hair. Her arms surpass gold, and now we come to the relevant part. Her fingers are like lily, like lotus lilies, so like the water lily, drooping of buttocks, firm good in her midst. Her legs show forth her beauty. And with this, I would like to thank you and invite your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Melanie. This was wonderful. Thank you for presenting us with all this beautiful material and also for posing all of these incredibly relevant questions. And thank you also for sharing your further reading list with us. I think if any of our participants today would like to receive your slides, they can write either to me or to you, and we will share them if that's okay.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. So please, everyone, before we start the Q&A, will you join me in thanking Melanie for her talk? I'll do it with my real hands, but you can use your Zoom hands as well if you like. Thank you. And I know it can be tricky with Zoom sometimes, but if you are at all able to turn on your cameras during the discussion, that would be wonderful because then Melanie and I can see you. And now the floor is open. We have at least half an hour. And please feel free to ask comments, ask questions, make comments. You can either write to me in the chat and I'll put you on my speakers list, and you can also raise your Zoom hand. Hello, Jane. Thank you for being here. We have greetings from Philadelphia. This is one of my favorite parts about these talks is that we always have people from at least 2 continents that joining us. But please go ahead, questions or comments. The floor is open.
Yeah, and also if then you can really also have then more wider discussion. So if you then would like to chip in and answering some of the questions, someone else from the Zoom, yeah, be welcome to do so.
Ulrike, please go ahead.
Hello again. Do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Excellent. I would like to make a small contribution. Not to always put my things in the center here, but I analyzed the wearing habits of jewelry from cemeteries in Middle Egypt between Kawal Kebir and Matmar, from the early Old Kingdom to the early Middle Kingdom. So it's a rural basic population that was laid to rest there, and I checked what kind of jewelry is worn and who gets to wear it. So what does the men wear, the women, and the children? And thanks to the excellent work of Guy and Winifred Brunton, sexing was done if possible. So what I can say about imitation flowers, figurative amulets in the shape of imitation flowers, is that they are extremely rare. We have them in the early first intermediate period, or in the first intermediate period, that's the earliest that I have them there, and in the early Middle Kingdom. But as I said, extremely rare. I have about just under 2,000 burials there, analyzed, and it's just a handful that has something like that. And amongst the ones that were sexed, it's only women and children that get to wear this. And I have to say that this is not part of an Uzech color, because those things weren't worn by the rural population at that time. They were buried with their personal possessions. So no funerary industry, it's what people wore in real life. And that's why I would put those amulets again in the same realm as the stamp seals, that they are more either for, status, prestige, or for magical purposes. So that, again, it's extremely rare. So I'd be curious, and differs immensely from what is done in the residence, the kinds of jewelry and the way they were worn. So I'd be interested in what you found out for the earliest beginnings of who gets to wear flower imitations, not the real things, but the flower imitations?
I haven't looked into those because in general, I'm a first millennium person. So even though I started out with the second millennium, but my main focus is really on cross-regional migration in the first millennium. So yeah, going through this material is actually, yeah, it's been really interesting, but it's not really what I'm mainly doing. And I've been, yeah, reading through the stuff that has been already compiled then in this museum exhibition catalogs, or when they were specifically either books or papers on flowers, or ideally on flower jewelry. But I've not been then checking in detail what has been done earlier. And I've also, it's been not easier. So I would have liked to show this evidence of this fourth dynasty first woman evidence of smelling the flower, but it's not been easy to come across because the reference doesn't give them the specific source, and as it's so outside my general focus, but it's been really interesting to hear from this evidence from you. Could you just briefly indicate, also you said rural population, can you nonetheless give a bit more of an indication what social level they would be in? Because rural can still, it's obviously it's not court, but especially in Egypt, where you have this strong regional powers also, you can also have in this regional areas rather high status people. So where are we situated roughly in the social stratum of?
The way the Bruntons describe those cemeteries is that they are in the flat desert. They're not in the desert mountains. So you have the better-to-do people usually in rock tombs in the desert mountains. If you think about for the 12th dynasty, for example, the Warkas in Kawel Kebir, or if you think about all those nomarchs in Asyut on Asyut el-Rabi, Jebel Asyut el-Rabi. So those tombs are not there, and they are not the enlarged household of those nomarchs or the better-to-do people. They're in the flat desert, but they're probably not the bottom of society. Because the Bruntons also describe that they tested several cemeteries, and when there weren't enough finds, they would stop digging them. So I'd say it's above those very poor cemeteries, but definitely not the highest echelons of provincial administration.
And have you been looking in this context also into the elite tombs? So the very prevalent comment I've been coming through is that this, especially the smelling of flowers, to some degree the bouquets, but especially, but to a certain extent, then also the other floral jewelry has been in evidence also before, but that there is actually a huge increase and they become only prominent from the New Kingdom onwards. Would you say that's true? Because for me, the immediate reaction is that, of course, that may be true, but to which degree this is just simply a question of what is looked at in Egyptology in more detail or not. So I'm not sure whether this assessment, even though from the extant evidence that's published, that certainly is the case, but whether this reflects ancient realities. Do you have there any ideas, or anyone else who would like to chip into the discussion?
Yeah, well, I guess the one point would be that the elite is usually rather emulating what the court elite does. So they are buried with a different set of jewelry, you know, that and type of things that are made by a funerary industry. So it's similar to what you would expect in a Memphite necropolis, for example. So we have different functions there of the jewelry. And well, the only exception to that would indeed be the Oasis governor in Balad. Medu Nefer, who was buried with hundreds of figurative amulets, as if he was, you know, a better-to-do farmer's wife in between Kaul Kebir and Matmar. That was an odd thing and extremely interesting. But when it comes to depictions, I totally agree with you. The depictions of those lavish bouquets, I couldn't tell you any Middle Kingdom example for that. It's always the smelling of a lotus flower and then maybe a lotus bud or two in the hands, but nothing like that, what's called in German Stabstrauß, or yeah, those big floral arrangements. Well, at least I don't know any from Middle Kingdom contexts.
Thank you both very much. We have a question in the chat as well from Sandra. Sandra, I don't know if you'd like to ask it yourself, if you're able to. Might not be possible. Then I'll just read it. Sandra says, thank you very much for a presentation. Looking at the reconstructions of the wreaths, it seems that each color line was composed of a single kind of flower. Do you think there might be a specific significance underneath the choice of flower species included in the floral compositions?
I'm pretty sure there was. So in a way, a bit the challenge is that we don't have so many organic materials surviving then also as full color. So the sample where we can really make a certain assessment is small, but whatever we have, this seems to be indeed the case, that the each line of the color is kind of was constructed as these garlands was in one, or essentially then all in all composed by 4 different organic materials, because the underlying string kind of and the knotting are usually 2 different materials. Then the leaf, a tree or shrub leaf, is a different species, and then the flower, but that the color itself would then typically be one specific one. I assume that the range of flowers, it's just 4 or 5, at least if you are looking at this major scope of material, which dates to the New Kingdom and early 3rd intermediate period. It very strongly changes as soon as you are getting into the late, and especially the Greco-Roman period, where you have much more mixed versions or then completely different flower arrangements. What we have beforehand typically is white lily, blue lily, or white water lily, blue water lily, sometimes pink water lily, cornflower, poppy, then potentially combined, and this is where you get a bit out of it. So if you have this either mandrake or persea fruit, they are typically not in one line, but they are interspersed then in there, but the flowers typically are indeed one. And but whether they are really then, yeah, whether the layering is a matter of being pleasing to the eye, or whether there is actually, whether from the color or from the flower, from the physicality of the, also whether it's nourishment or medicinal purposes or whatever, whether there is this additional level of usage included in order to make then sense, is something I don't think we can know from the existing examples. I certainly don't know.
No, it's hard to tell, but it's an interesting reflection. Just to follow up on this specifically, you showed us those beautiful reconstructions from the publication of the Fleur de Pharaon. The red ones there, do you know what type of flower
they are? Poppies.
They're poppies. Okay.
But the alternative would be then pomegranate, but pomegranate only then from the later New Kingdom onwards. So they seem to have been coming into Egypt from the Levant, but they can then be the one or the other. And we have also both of them then, but especially cornflower or we quite often cannot say, especially then with cornflower or with pomegranate, what is actually depicted in the kind of what I would call then in this case imitation flower or organic necklaces, when they are made of semi-precious stones, specifically out of carniole. They actually rather look like cornflowers, but due to the reddish material, it's actually also possible that they should be understood as pomegranate. So it's not always easy to decide. And the question is then, but we, in my view, again, don't have the amount of evidence to really make a proper case for the one or the other, whether this was really so significant or not.
Yeah, and I mean it's not alien to ancient aesthetics to have ambiguity in representation as well. So, but thank you so much for that, Alexandra. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I wanted to further go into the direction of this, what you were talking earlier about, that you think that there are things which are not represented, but did exist, because I think this is indeed a very important point. And we have several such cases, of course, that we do not find things in representation in some periods, but we do actually have them in the archaeology, and either not represented or very rarely, which is probably due to what Baines calls decorum. So, for example, if you think about the dress Egyptian people are normally wearing, they are, well, you do see, of course, the kilt in the Old Kingdom and in the New Kingdom are different. But, for example, apart from the harpers in the tomb of Ramses III, I've never seen anybody wearing sort of a galabia, which those guys definitely do, and which is very much reminding of the things which is seen now as a traditional Egyptian garment. Or if you think, for example, about the question of, well, if you see the shoes Tutankhamun had, and I mean some very strange, fancy stuff which you never ever see anywhere depicted in the 18th dynasty on a king or anybody else, then again, funnily enough, some of these very fancy things remind very much of things that are actually depicted, worn by Meroitic kings much, much later. So I even wonder whether maybe they were actually things from Nubia, which the king had important and used, but we don't see them in Nubia in this period, but later. I mean, maybe it could have been different. Again, this is the problem. We have just this one find, and so it's not clear. But these are just two examples. There are actually quite a few more one could cite.
Good. But this is kind of the key point in both directions. We sometimes have stuff depicted for which we at least so far don't have evidence. Whether this is because it was then depicted from earlier on or idealized, but was at that time not worn, or it is because, and this is a major issue in Egyptology, most of the towns, the settlements are not excavated. Also, the poorer burials are typically not excavated, and many of these, even if they would have been excavated, would not preserve organic remains, because you need very specific conditions. So it's quite telling that we have, even though we do have from the late period a lot of mummy covers, etc., we don't have much of these floral realia from the Memphis or northern Upper Egypt, northern Nile Valley area, but we have it specifically from Thebes, mainly from Thebes. It's certainly a question of excavating there, but there's also has very many levels, and I think it's really, really important to think about what happened on which levels of society, and always have to keep in mind, especially for the temple and for the funerary context, that the reason for depicting it needed to be specific enough that it would work. But the key point in ancient Egypt is that it has to be kind of ancient and petrified in itself, very strongly, with any kind of technology that is depicted that has no relation to, at that time, technology. But for this floral jewelry, we simply just don't have sufficient evidence to make proper cases in one way or the other, even though I would love to.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether it's always needed to be ancient, but it's certainly just a very, well, small range of things that were definitely decided to depict and others not. But speaking of the floral things, of course, we know most of the actual finds from indeed Tutankhamun. But as you were talking about this collection of Schweinfurt things from the Zurich Museum, do you know that the Botanical Museum in Berlin also has a tiny collection of things from Schweinfurt, actually from pre-dynastic grain samples up to flower remains of Roman Fayum. So that also, I mean, it's just tiny things, but still.
But I think the Schweinfurt material is actually distributed across 5 or 6 museums. But what was really striking was, even though one knew that Schweinfurt had some of the material in Zurich, because a lot of it was actually originally processed there in the late 19th century. The interesting stuff, or that which brought up the issue, the question, and pushed really forward a bit the question of flowers in ancient Egypt, was this unexpected find of lost, not known about boxes that are coming up with a lot of additional material. Some of it, unfortunately, by now in problematic condition. The glass frames were not always good. There were a lot of mold inside, but a lot of it was able to be solved. But the ones I showed here, actually, they are not from the Schweinfurt collection, not from Zurich. They are actually from the Metropolitan Museum, if I remember correctly.
Right.
The material from the Berlin Museum, I remember that there was some Egyptian, I think she was a doctoral student who did her PhD about this, so it should in principle, but I'm not sure whether it's published or so, but I know that it has been worked on by some Egyptologists several years ago.
Thank you both very much. I'm going to move us on to the next comment. Bruno, please go ahead.
Rather a short point and remark connecting to your remark on the love poetry. It actually, while you talked about the issue of attestations in the problem of real life use, right, that we always have, I was remembering that actually on a short fragment on Papyrus Gardiner 304 recto, there is a short remark on the color. Like it's kind of probably a love poem. Judging from the content, I mean the context is a bit unclear in the scene. But there is also this idea of the lover wearing actually a flower collar, also linked to the seal, to the reeds, to the bracelets, possibly the lotus. So that was,
It would be
yeah,
great if you could send me the reference to
of
that.
course. Of course, happy to do so. I mean, it's always a question. It's a different kind of evidence to rely on texts, but it's a single thing there that might be interesting.
But that's kind of the lovely thing. That's what we've been discussing originally, Anna and I, when she asked me whether I would be willing to give a paper in it. And the key point was, or that's at least how she broadcasted, is that this lecture is actually meant to look at something that's out of what you're usually doing, but have been kind of interested in, to take it as an opportunity to look a bit into the stuff. And this is where my key point really is. It's not something that I'm probably writing a paper about or anything. It's just, but it then allows you to, and the point is to think about questions to ask, thoughts to bring, and evidence that might be useful for someone else who is actually working on that stuff, but from a different subject area. Then these things can easily come together within one presentation without bothering them too much about how it's contextualized, because the aim is just to show what kind of material is there, so that whoever is working on it, because also you cannot immediately then take the Egyptian material and transfer it to the Levant and say, okay, we have it there, so we must have the same here. So the idea of bringing many different ideas, or show the range of material that we have with its problematic sides to it, obviously, was kind of what the aim of this lecture is. And on this level, this is really what I'm really glad, both the first comment and now, that if I get more evidence, that's also just collecting. One never knows whether one wants to make something out of it. And I'm always curious, so everything to get is always good.
Thank you both. I've rudely put myself on the list, and I have sort of two questions in a way, and one I think is possibly the simple one, which is that you showed us one of your first slides. You showed us images of dried wreaths that were found in funerary contexts, and I think two of the images were from the tomb of Tutankhamun, and then there was one which was from another tomb. But I just noticed that the text, there was a picture text. I think that it was another one than this one. But the picture says, that one. So slide number 5. The picture's text said that the flowers were olive leaves, blue lotus, water lilies, cornflower, and celery leaves. And I just wanted, I mean, as far as I know, cornflowers and olive leaves, they don't really give off much of a scent, but they're very pretty. And then celery leaves, I have to admit defeat. I do not know if they smell of celery or not, but celery tends to be quite a distinct fragrance if it's there. And then, of course, you already mentioned during your talk that the blue lotus water lilies are really the punchy stuff. They're the ones that would overpower. So would that, I mean, taking this particular example, do you think that would be the case as well, that blue lotus water lilies would be like the impactful fragrance that you would get out of this kind of combination?
Yes, I would definitely think so, and I think that this is really also very largely meant, at least if we assume, and I think especially for a funerary context, it's safe to assume that the symbolism of rebirth, of helping to ensure the transcending from this to the other world, and then to remain alive and vigorous in afterlife. And this is very strongly one of the key. It's also, it has other symbolisms like beauty, etc. as well. But one of the most prominent one is this, the mix of rebirth, rejuvenation, and revigorating, and this is exactly what you need. So I think it's, for the funerary context, very safe to assume that it's wanted, that this is the major fragrance component, while the others are much less. But the question is then, and this is something where you can make a case on it, but I think it's not necessarily needed, that the other, especially in this bouquet stuff that's here, which combines then, so it's strongly on papyrus or on sycamore, and then has definitely always a major component of this water lily, whether white or yellow, or sometimes a mix of all three colors, but that these other colors may be primarily also the pleasing arrangement to show the abundance and to show the colorfulness, liveliness as a composition, and not necessarily with the color symbolism, which as I said, each color that's used can be tied into it, but I think it may also be simply that this pleasing arrangement, that as an arrangement shows what you can make out of life if you do cultivation in Egypt, maybe the predominant motivation, but that's just in both directions, in a way, both just speculation.
Absolutely. It appears to me it must have looked beautiful. I was also curious, you showed us these details of how the weaving of these garland colors was done, and also you mentioned how this is possible to have as a profession. I mean, to make these beautiful things. And I was just wondering the way you envision it, and I know it's impossible to give a definitive answer, but it seems to me that quite a lot of effort and work, and also of course the flowers, but quite a lot of effort and work has got into this. So do you imagine that these would have been wear once and throw away, or could they have multiple uses before they would wither so much that they weren't pleasing anymore? Because it seems like a lot of work, and a very striking case of conspicuous consumption in a way, if you only wear them once and then chuck them. I mean, in real life, not just in funerary contexts.
I really don't know about the colors, because I have really no idea how well they would actually preserve and be still pretty. And the question would then also be, for which occasions would they be worn, and is this specific? And there's just no way of getting to this level on which occasion they would be worn, or whether if they are worn then for a major feast. I would assume at least that you would then, as now when you are you going to your end of school ball or whatever, and you have some lovely flower arrangement, that you may either dry it off or put it then as a garland on the wall if it's not worn on. But we have some information on these bouquet issues, and there's the point, so we also have textual evidence on it, but also then the imagery, and they actually have been alive that's at least 2 to 3 days, if not more, because they are called differently and have different properties when they are first arranged. And then the aim is to give them into the temple, and only when they are then getting into the immediate vicinity of a deity, they get this specific life property, by which they then change also the name. Then they become the Ant, which is the word, simply the word for binding the things together. So that's kind of one way, but the same word is then also the Egyptian word for life. So this comes together. And then when they are coming back from the temple, are given back to the elite person, then they would either be worn or then they would be given away to someone else. And at least in the New Kingdom, early Third Intermediate period, we have both textual, but especially then the imagery evidence of then presenting them. There is I've not put it on the list, but there is actually from Munich a dissertation, a relatively old one, on flowers and these bouquets as offerings, which is specifically, I think it's from 1986, who is dealing exactly with the question of when these bouquets, by whom are these bouquets given? Are they given by the gods to private persons, by the god to kings? the other way around, or from private person to private person, and she found actually nearly the full range of evidence, but unfortunately also there then this aspect of, okay, when and why is it done? Yeah, the study stops. So
wow, fascinating. Thank you. It's a whole new world to me, this, and I'm really
it was as well.
soaking it in. We've reached the end of our time, unfortunately, and before I ask you to join me in thanking Melanie, I'm just going to switch to my commercial break, as I sometimes think of it. And first, I would like to mention that in 3 weeks, we have the next lecture in the series, which is unfortunately this time also the last lecture in this series. But it's on Friday, December 6th at 3 p.m. Oslo time. And there we have Dr. Laurence Dassigny-Tréprenier and also Dr. Anne Letourneau, both from the University of Montreal in Canada. And Laurence and Anne are going to give the talk Bejeweled Biblical Animals, Constructing Gender with Non-Human Bling. So 3 weeks from now, December 6th, please do join us for that as well if you can. And then my final advertisement is just to mention that when we did the series Ancient Attire 2 years ago, we did actually have a lecture on Tutankhamun's clothes as well. It was Dr. Rosalind Jansen who was talking. She gave the talk called "Unpacking Tutankhamun's Wardrobe," and I, as a bit of a teaser, I can mention that there was quite a lot of talk on Tutankhamun's underwear. So if you're in any way interested in whether Tutankhamun wore briefs or boxers, please go to our website, Ancient Attire, and look up the talk from August 26th from 2022. It's available there as a recording. Commercial break is over. Thank you so much, Melanie, for this amazing discussion and amazing presentation. It was delightful. Thank you all for being here and for your questions and comments. So let's thank Melanie. Thank you so much for coming and have a lovely
Thank you for
weekend.
having me and for this really lovely discussion.
Thank you so much.